So now I want to come to the Russia-Ukraine war and the negotiations that are going to start. So I would like to ask you, since you have been an IR scholar for a very long time, what is the importance of the world's two great nuclear powers re-establishing contact after a period of 3 years?
They're trying to reorganize the relationship with the Russians. And as Kellogg also suggested, they would like to do this for one purpose, or the main purpose, not just to get along well with Russia, but also to pull it a little bit away from China, Iran, also North Korea. All of this got a bit too close, and they're very uncomfortable with it. So this is what is happening. There's a rationality behind this.
So do you think Donald Trump will be able to successfully drive a wedge between China and Russia, or is it too late?
Well, yes and no. Well, to start with the no, there won't be a wedge. Like they won't turn on each other. Russia and China, they both envision creating a multipolar international economic system. That in order to do this, the most important partner for both of them is the other. China can't, it's a leading economy, but it can't, integrate the whole Eurasian continent without Russia. It doesn't work. And if you ignore their interest, Russia will become a very powerful adversary, as the Europeans have noticed.
So now I want to come to the Russia-Ukraine war and the negotiations that are going to start. So I would like to ask you, since you have been an IR scholar for a very long time, what is the importance of the world's two great nuclear powers re-establishing contact after a period of 3 years?
For the United States reaching out to Russia.
Yes, the importance of Trump and Putin finally talking after 3 years.
Well, I think it's immensely important. But in terms of the war, it's if you look at it from European eyes, it's worth noting that the Americans very much pushed the Europeans into this, and now the Americans are leaving, and leaving the Europeans to deal with the mess, which is the benefit when you have an entire ocean between you. But I think it's much wider than the past 3 years. I think it's the reconsidering the entire post-Cold War order. Because what is really NATO? What is the purpose? The decision in the 90s to begin to expand NATO, it was a manifestation of a security system the Americans wanted to build based on unipolarity, that is global primacy. We actually had deals with the Russians for a pan-European, that is an inclusive security institution, and agreements based on indivisible security. So one side shouldn't expand their security at the expense of others. We shouldn't have dividing lines. We had all these things, but then we realized the Russians were really, really weak. So, and America came up instead with the idea of not security based on recognizing each other's security concerns and trying to mitigate it, but instead they came with a strategy: let's have unipolarity, which means we don't have to take into consideration what the Russians think. We'll be so powerful that it simply doesn't matter. They will just have to adjust to whatever we do. This is more or less what they said in direct words in Washington back then. Who cares what they think? They're a third-rate power. We can do as we want. No one can even dream of challenging us. Doesn't matter who's unhappy, who we threaten. This is it's only one central power. You're gonna have to adjust. Now we've had 30 years of this, and it turns out that as they recognize in America, the power has shifted dramatically. The U.S. and the political West are in relative decline. So now they're more or less saying, or as Rubio has already pointed out, Marco Rubio, that unipolarity is already gone. Now, if you recognize this, you're going to have to change your entire approach to security. Because if you want to ignore all of Russia's security concerns, ignore all of China's security concerns, ignore Iran, everyone else, well, what are they going to do? They're going to start to ally together, cooperate, and balance the United States. This is what the Americans don't want, and they're very vocal about this. So now they're going to have to adjust, and this is what the Americans are communicating. We're going to have to take into consideration that Russia also has security concerns in Europe, and maybe simply putting our missiles all along their borders is not the best approach to security. That worked in a unipolar order. We put missiles across the border. If you don't like it, who cares? But in a multipolar world, this is a problem. So now they're trying to reorganize the relationship with the Russians. And as Kellogg also suggested, they would like to do this for one purpose, or the main purpose, not just to get along well with Russia, but also to pull it a little bit away from China, Iran, also North Korea. All of this got a bit too close, and they're very uncomfortable with it. So this is what is happening. There's a rationality behind this. I think in Europe they have a very narrow view. They just see everything as either being tough for Putin or being a Putin puppet. They don't see the national interest behind the whole thing. So no, I think this is the main goal of the Americans. Stop pushing your adversaries together, um, and yeah, this is the direction they're taking. I think it would have happened eventually. It's just that Trump is putting it yeah, on steroids. Is doing it much faster than I had predicted as well.
So, do you think like Donald Trump will be able to successfully drive a wedge between China and Russia, or is it too late?
Uh, well, yes and no. Well, to start with, the no, there won't be a wedge. Like they won't turn on each other. Russia and China, they both envision creating a multipolar international economic system. That in order to do this, the most important partner for both of them is the other. China can't, it's a leading economy, but it can't, integrate the whole Eurasian continent without Russia. It doesn't work. And if you ignore their interest, Russia will become a very powerful adversary, as the Europeans have noticed. And same with the Russians. They also want a new economic infrastructure, one that isn't excessively Western centric. And the main country who has both the capabilities and the intentions to do so, or the willingness, is China. So this partnership is set in stone now, the way I see it. You're not gonna break them apart. However, Russia wants a multipolar system. It doesn't just want to be a junior brother under a Chinese hegemony in a Chinese-centric world. So for the Russians, they would like to diversify. This is the main difference. They don't mind if China's the strongest economy. They just don't want them to dominate. Now, the difference is if you have some strategic autonomy, but also diversify. This is why it's, for example, important for the Russians to have this north-south international corridor, where they also link with Iran and India. And if they don't have all their eggs in the Chinese basket, they also have trade with India and deepen their economic connections. Then it's good. Then you have more centers of power. It was same as with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They brought in India and Pakistan because the institution began to take on more economic tasks. And once it went from military to economic, it meant that leadership was transferring from Russia to China. Now, what would you want to do in Russia if you want to make sure that it won't be Chinese dominated? You bring in some other large powers like India. Now the ability of China to dominate is reduced. It will still be the leading economy, but it can't dominate anymore. So this is the good thing. Bring in India, bring in Iran, and now you have many great powers, and it ensures multipolarity. So this is what the Russians are going for. But so they won't. Oh yeah, sorry, that was my point. Sorry. So as the Europeans recognized before, 3 years ago, you don't want to push the Russians, isolate them too much, because then you push them over to China. So it is in Russia's interest to diversify. So if the Europeans, Americans want to start to deal with them again, wonderful, because in a multipolar system, you want to connect with all centers of power. So they do want to cooperate more with the Europeans, cooperate more with the Americans. So they don't want to be too dependent on China. So that's where Russian interests and American interests are more or less the same. But the idea that they would switch and join like an American bloc against China in some bloc politics, I don't think that's going to happen. There's no chance. But to enable Russia to diversify, I think that's a goal on its own. It's a good goal. One that Japan also pursued. They also reached out to Russia, so they wouldn't be too dependent on China in Northeast Asia, and thus, be compelled to align with the Chinese against the Japanese. But so I think it's a good strategy by the Americans, as long as they limit the expectations. But again, they don't need Russia to join an anti-Chinese bloc. This is only necessary if you want to restore American dominance. If you're happy with America being one among equals, one among many great powers, then allowing Russia to diversify its ties and also trade more with America, I think that's good enough. But it depends. Again, I'm not sure what's going on in Trump's head, how much ambition he has to, be more powerful than China.
But one thing that I didn't understand about the American foreign policy establishment is that in the Cold War, America reached out to China because they wanted to hedge to hedge against the Soviet Union, and ultimately they ended up winning the Cold War. But in the post Cold War era, you are seeing America driving their two most foremost rivals together. But now I think Trump seems to be trying that Nixon strategy of once again reaching out to Russia in this new Cold War against China. So, do you have any take on it?
Yeah, well, what was done during the Cold War is when you have two adversaries who's working together, usually you sow some distrust between them, and then you reach out to the weaker one because the weaker one will always be unhappy about being the little brother. So during the Cold War, this is what Nixon and Kissinger could do. They could go to China, as this was weaker than the Soviet Union, and play on the discontent of being the smaller brother who's been ignored, and you try to win them over to your side of it, and thus create a wedge between them. So this was a good strategy then, and this is also what the Americans are doing now. Because when they look at the China-Russia couple, this is again Kissinger's worst nightmare that this would happen. But you don't have to reach out to China to help them, to save them from Russia, because now it's a reverse. Now China is the more powerful one, especially economically. So you reach out to Russia, who try to play on any concerns it has about a powerful China, and you try to bring it in. Again, I don't see this gonna happen, but it's at least better than this. It's an alternative to the strategy which was done by the Biden administration and all the over the past 3 years. Because if you listen to all of the main, not the main, but a lot of the American foreign policy elites, be it Lindsey Graham, Mitch McConnell, General Keith Kellogg, who's by now a negotiator, and many others, they've all been saying very openly the same thing. Like, what are we going to do about the Russia-China partnership? Well, we can use the Ukrainians to knock out Russia once we've severely weakened and essentially knocked Russia out from the ranks of great powers. Then we can just have our Ukrainian proxy there, and we can then begin to focus on China. Again, keep in mind, General Keith Kellogg, who is now Trump's negotiator to find a peace, not key negotiator, but part of the negotiation team to find a peace with Russia. He actually said, was it a year or two ago, that this was the acme of professionalism, when you can knock out one of your key rivals without even losing a single one of your own soldiers. So you get to fight with Ukrainians, and then America can instead shift all its resources on countering China. This was the top strategy one could ever have. So this was the goal. So you have these two ones. Okay, we knock out Russia, then we go for China. Now we realized we can't knock out Russia. We can't knock it out on the battlefield, and we can't destroy its economy, and we can't isolate it in international systems. So we are going to have to make our peace with the fact that Russia won this war, which, let's be honest, it's a NATO proxy war against Russia over the past 10 years. So we didn't succeed. And what do you do then? Well, then you're going to have to go into the more Kissinger approach, which is reach out to the weaker one, which is Russia, try to make friends and drive a wedge with the Chinese. I don't think this is going to work either, but there's nothing else to lean on at the moment.
Okay. And now I want to come to the negotiations. So Pete Hegseth has clearly said that NATO membership is ruled out for Ukraine, and he has also mentioned that Ukraine cannot return to its pre-2014 borders, essentially implying that Crimea will never be part of Ukraine again. So do you think the key hurdles have been removed to achieve a ceasefire and eventually a peace deal? And also, how does Trump ensure, like Pete Hegseth once again mentioned, that they don't want this new agreement to end up like like the Minsk agreements? So, how do you think a durable ceasefire and peace deal can be achieved without it being another version of the Minsk agreements?
Well, I think the key word there is the ceasefire, which is also why the Russians they're not interested in a ceasefire without a political settlement. Because what Minsk was, okay, let's stop the fighting as a ceasefire, because as you remember back in the days then, the Ukrainian army had been surrounded in Debaltseve by Donbass fighters, and we agreed to ceasefire, and after the ceasefire was established, we'll get on with the political settlement, which meant autonomy for Donbass. This was the Minsk agreement. But of course, once the ceasefire was in place, what's the point of implementing the political solution? Again, as American documents such as the one in the RAND Council or RAND Corporation in 2019 noted, the conflict in Donbass is quite good for us. We can just threaten a bit of NATO expansion, we can send some more weapons, and it bleeds a lot of Russian resources and over time. So it's a little dagger in the side of Russia who gets to bleed them along over time. So there was no real interest in solving it, which is why both the Germans and the French, who were the two countries who negotiated the Minsk agreement, later admitted there was no intention of implementing it. It was to buy time to arm Ukraine, because yes, you have a ceasefire, but instead of implementing the political deal, you just build up a very powerful Ukrainian army, you change realities on the ground, and now they don't have to adjust anymore. This is why we started a few years after Minsk talk about, well, the situation has changed, suggesting we should renegotiate or follow the spirit of the agreement. So this is, or my favorite was suggested that Russia hadn't implemented its side of Minsk agreement, even though Russia wasn't part of the Minsk agreement. It was between Kiev and Donbass. But this is what the Russians are afraid of. They don't want ceasefire without a political settlement. And this seems to be what America wants as well now, because, again, as we know, with Trump, he wants to get America out of Ukraine so they can get out of Europe. If this is just going to drag on, then Americans aren't going anywhere. So they seem to want the same thing now. But can they achieve it? Well, I think the Americans just agreed to the two main things that Russia wanted. One was the neutrality for Ukraine. This was the main thing this was the main reason why Russia invaded to begin with. And as we learned in early 2022, this was the only thing the Russians insisted on in this peace negotiations they had with Ukraine in Istanbul, which the Americans and British sabotaged so they can have a long war with Russia. And so this was important. But also the Russians say, after 3 years of fighting, we annexed 4 regions of Ukraine. We want them too, because and part of the logic there is, not only is it considered to be historical Russian territory as important resources, all this, but also the Americans the next administration can come in 4 years and just rip everything up and try to pull Ukraine back into NATO. So by stripping Ukraine of some of its strategic territory, they essentially hedged against any future conflicts. So in which the Americans might want to get Crimea or anything else in the east. So this is the main two things the Russians want: neutrality, and they want territorial concessions. Now, a key problem would also have been the security guarantees, because if you're going to put NATO troops on Russia's borders to uphold the peace, this is also not going to work, because Russia invaded to prevent NATO's incursion into Ukraine. And who knows how long NATO could stay. This would effectively become over time a de facto NATO membership, and in the peace agreement they might actually end up in NATO anyways. So the Americans also did this third point where they said there won't be any US security guarantees. And let's be honest, the Europeans, I don't really doubt that they will do any security guarantees to Ukraine unless America has their backs. Because as the Americans said, if then there's no Article 5, no NATO involved, which means if something goes wrong and Russia begins to shell European troops in Ukraine, then the Americans won't come to save them. So the Europeans are not interested in this. So, but it all depends. I think these ideas, commitments, they have to be defined better. Is it only no NATO membership in this peace agreement, or they're promising no NATO membership, not just in 10 or 20 years, but permanent neutrality for Ukraine? And same with the territorial concessions. What territorial concessions? The Russians annexed 4 regions of Ukraine, that is Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. But Russia's not controlling all of these territories. Do the Russians demand the entire regions, even where the part of the region they're not controlling? I think the Americans could probably put some pressure on the Russians to make them scale back some of their demands, given how much the Trump administration is willing to concede to Russia. They might be successful if they push for Ukraine to get some of to not surrender the territory which it hasn't lost yet. So there might be something there, but they still have to be discussed. Same as the security guarantees. I don't think the Russians would accept any European troops in Ukraine either, just because the animosity towards the Europeans are now very, very high after 3 years of proxy war.
Or do you visualize a scenario where Professor John Mearsheimer, who's a frequent guest on your show, which I enjoy as well, has said that Russia and President Putin will try to completely make Ukrainian a rump state so that the points which you mentioned never arise again. Do you foresee such a scenario happening?
Well, I think yes and no. I agree with John on this point. That is, but it has to be pointed out the Russians didn't think that they were going to ever get a deal with America. So, because again, for 3 years we said we won't have any diplomacy with you. We're not going to sit down with you. We're just going to fight to the last Ukrainian. Well, not using those words, but that's what it meant. Now, if you're Russia, then of course it makes sense. You want to take strip Ukraine of the historically Russian region, which is from Kharkov to Odessa, because, well, here you find people, some people at least, who will welcome you, who will be civilian administrators. It's also where that happens to have most of the resources, and rare earth metals, oil, gas, agriculture. It's the coastline. So this was the idea. Russia would just strip Ukraine of the territories which it couldn't afford to see ending up in NATO's hands. And regarding the rest of Ukraine, what remains this rump state. Just destroy it more or less, make it a huge, as much mess out of it as possible. So no electric grids, no nothing, and destroy the main industries, just so it can't function as a serious state. Because if it can't function as a serious state, it can't be used to threaten Russia. Now, of course, this was also my argument, which is why you should have to recognize Russia's security concern. If you don't, Russia will just annihilate and destroy Ukraine in a brutal way, because it's simply in the interest of Russian security to do so. So this is why I said it's very dangerous not to take into account their security. Now, this being said, this was premised on the idea that that there would never be a deal. This is something that John Mearsheimer also assumed, that it has to be solved on the battlefield, because the Americans would never agree to the terms of Russia, because there's very strong terms. No NATO, give us the territories, no security guarantees. This is a very humiliating piece, both for the Ukrainians and also the Europeans. But America seems to be conceding it. Now, if you're conceding it, that means Russia doesn't have to destroy Ukraine. So if you have a neutral Ukraine, which NATO will stay out of, so I'm hoping at least that it doesn't seem like this to the Europeans, but I think this is a blessing, because if Russia doesn't destroy Ukraine, destroyed Ukraine will be very unstable. A huge waves of migration. It would need economic support. It would just, it would be unpredictable. So I'm hoping that now that there's some possibility that Americans and Russians can reach a peace, they will have to impose it on the Ukrainians and Europeans, because they won't agree on anything. But if they're successful at this, I think the Russians wouldn't see it in their interest or necessity to make a basket case out of a Ukrainian rump state. So they may even be willing to make some territorial concessions themselves if they think they get a proper deal, which will be honored by the West as well. So I think this is the point of a multipolar world. You don't take into account consideration the security concern of your adversaries because you're a good guy or out of charity. You do it because if you don't, they will respond, and when they're responding, it will not be good for your security. In the case of Ukraine, they will destroy Ukraine. So I'm hoping now that we accommodate the Russians, perhaps then you will see a very different policy from the Russian side as well. So at least this is my hope. And I spoke to John Mearsheimer only a few days ago, and he said he also had to now reconsider completely, because he had not expected Americans to accept this. But now there's actual possibility of making a peace deal. So all the calculations have to change now, I think.
Perhaps a new president for Ukraine. I think Zaluzhny is tipped to be the new president if elections were held.
Yeah, well, that's another thing. The Russians do not care much for Zelensky. They seem they don't want him. They want the regime change effectively. And for the American side, Zelensky is not accepting. He's being after 3 years, a lot of his own power ambitions depend on the continuation of this conflict as well. So he's set very extreme demands, which also can't be met. So the Americans wouldn't mind to see him go as well. And it happens, that Americans and Russians can make him go away, because the Russians refer to it as having him removed. The Americans, more diplomatic in their tone, perhaps, they said, Kellogg said, we need to have elections again in Ukraine because the presidential term of Zelensky has already expired. So what that means is, given that Zelensky is incredibly unpopular in Ukraine, if there's an election, there's no chance, not a snowball chance in hell, that he can get reelected. So regime change means elections, and that's what the Americans have said now as well. So if they can get him out of the way, then you'll have the Russians, Ukrainians, and possibly Americans all being on the same page of what a settlement would look like, and then there's not much the Europeans can do anymore, anyways. So I think everyone can fall in line eventually.
So it remains to be seen if a new elections is set.